Welcome to the Fear Files channel. Today we're diving into one of the most terrifying and mysterious crimes in German history. A case that, more than 100 years later, continues to haunt the minds of criminologists, historians, and lovers of unsolved mysteries. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck farm, where in March 1922, 6 people were murdered, and the circumstances of this crime are so sinister and inexplicable that they still give no peace to anyone who has ever encountered this case. Get comfortable, because today's story will be long, detailed, and truly frightening. Hinterkaifeck is not the name of a village or town, as many might think. It's the name of a small, isolated farm located approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich, between the small Bavarian settlements of Wadhausen and Grobern. Today, this place no longer exists. The farm was demolished a year after the tragedy, but in 1922, it was a typical agricultural holding where the Gruber family lived. The area around the farm was quite desolate. The nearest neighbors were located several hundred meters away, which in those times meant almost complete isolation, especially after dark. The farm itself consisted of a residential house, a livestock barn, and a shed. The buildings were solid, typical for prosperous Bavarian peasants of that time. The Gruber family was not impoverished. They had livestock, the land yielded crops, and the household prospered under the leadership of the family head, 63-year-old Andreas Gruber. But it was precisely the isolation of this farm, its remoteness from human eyes and ears, that played a key role in the horrifying tragedy that unfolded here on a cold March night. Now let's meet the people who lived on this farm and became victims of one of the most brutal crimes in German history. The head of the family, Andreas Gruber, was a stern 63-year-old peasant, a man of the old school, accustomed to hard physical labor and rural way of life. According to neighbors' recollections, he was a withdrawn and not particularly sociable person, preferring to keep to himself and not too warmly welcoming guests. Some even called him stingy and suspicious, but at the same time, everyone acknowledged that as a master he was skilled and thrifty. His wife, Kazilia Gruber, with a year younger than her husband, having turned 62. Less is known about her, but neighbors described her as a typical peasant wife of that time, silent, hard-working, completely absorbed in household duties. The family had a daughter, Victoria, a 35-year-old widow. Her husband had died in World War I, and after his death, Victoria returned with 2 children to her parents' home on the farm. She had 2 children, a 7-year-old daughter, Kazilia, named after her grandmother, and a 2-year-old son, Joseph. Here we need to make an important digression, because the Gruber family history was far from cloudless and contained dark pages that would later become one of the versions in the murder investigation. The fact is that in the small rural community, persistent rumors circulated that Andreas Gruber was in an incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria, and that little Joseph was actually not his grandson, but his son. These rumors were never proven, but they were so persistent that they even made it into the investigation materials. Moreover, shortly before the murders, legal proceedings were initiated against Andreas on charges of incest, but they never took place due to the death of the entire family. The 6th and final member of the household was the maid Maria Baumgartner, a 44-year-old woman who came to work on the farm just a few days before the tragedy. And this is another sinister detail of this story, which we will return to later. The previous maid had quit the farm 6 months before the murders, stating that something strange and frightening was happening in the house, that she heard inexplicable sounds from the attic and could no longer stay there. Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm literally a few hours before the tragedy unfolded and became one of the victims. And now we come to one of the most chilling parts of this story, to a series of strange and inexplicable events that occurred on the farm over several days and even weeks before the murder. These events are so sinister that they make blood run cold even a century after the tragedy. Andreas Gruber, despite his secrecy and reluctance to share personal matters, still told several neighbors about the oddities that disturbed him. A few days before the murder, specifically on March 31st, 1922, Andreas discovered footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farm. The tracks went through the field straight to the farm buildings, but the most terrifying thing, there were no return tracks. Someone had come to the farm, but no one had left. Andreas carefully examined all the buildings, trying to find the uninvited guest, but found no one. He told a neighbor about this, and the neighbor advised him to be careful and keep the doors locked. But Andreas apparently did not attach sufficient importance to this, although he was disturbed. But this was only the beginning. A few months before the murder, Andreas found a newspaper from Munich lying on the farm property. This was strange because the Gruber family didn't subscribe to this newspaper, and none of the neighbors did either. Where did it come from? Who brought it? Andreas couldn't find answers to these questions. Then he began hearing strange sounds coming from the attic of the residential house. The sounds were distinct, footsteps, creaking floorboards, as if someone was walking up there when all family members were downstairs. Andreas went up to the attic several times to check, but found no one there. Each time the attic was empty. But the most sinister thing happened literally a day before the murder. Andreas discovered that the bunch of house keys had gone missing. He searched for them thoroughly, but the keys had vanished into thin air. This meant that someone could have access to the house, could enter and exit unnoticed. And Andreas also said he heard sounds like footsteps in the attic above the bedroom, right at night when the whole family had already gone to bed. These sounds were so distinct that they woke him up, but when he went up to check, he again found no one. The previous maid who had worked for the Grubers and quit 6 months before the murder told something similar. She claimed that she constantly heard strange sounds coming from the attic and felt that someone was watching her. One night, she woke up from the sensation of someone's presence in the room and was certain she saw the shadow of a person standing in the doorway. She was so frightened that the very next morning she packed her things and left, despite the good pay and working conditions. When she was later asked why she left so hastily, she replied that something devilish was happening on the farm, and she couldn't stay there another day. All these events create an extremely sinister picture. Someone, quite obviously, was watching the family, penetrating the farm property, possibly even hiding in the house's attic for some time. This unknown person was studying the family's daily routine, their habits, planning something terrible. And the most frightening thing, the Gruber family was in complete isolation. There was nowhere to expect help, and the nearest neighbors were at such a distance that they couldn't hear cries for help. March 31st, 1922 was a cold and overcast day. At the Hinterkaifeck farm, the usual routine work was underway. They needed to manage the household, feed the livestock, prepare food. The new maid Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm in the afternoon and began her duties. She didn't know she would live only a few more hours. According to the reconstruction of events that the police would later conduct, the murder began in the evening, when it got dark, approximately between 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening. Andreas Gruber and his wife Kazilia were in the barn, where they had gone to feed the livestock and carry out evening farm chores. The killer, who, as we can now assume with a high degree of probability, was already on the farm, possibly hiding in the barn or somewhere nearby, attacked them first. The murder weapon was a pickaxe-matic, a heavy agricultural tool with a sharp blade on one end and a flat striker on the other. This was a tool that could be found in any household, but in the killer's hands, it turned into an instrument of monstrous massacre. The blows were delivered with enormous force. The victims' skulls were literally shattered. The forensic medical examination would later establish that the killer struck repeatedly, with fury, and not only to the head but also to the body. Andreas Gruber received multiple skull injuries. His face was practically unrecognizable. Kazilia was also killed by blows to the head. Their bodies remained lying in the barn, in the straw and dirt, in a pool of blood. But the bloody carnage didn't end there. After murdering the Gruber spouses, the killer headed to the house. Here, as investigators believe, he encountered Victoria and 7-year-old Kazilia Jr., who had possibly come out of the house to find out why their parents hadn't returned from the barn for so long. They were killed in the same way, with powerful blows of the pickaxe-matic to the head. Victoria, trying to protect her daughter, received particularly brutal injuries. Forensic experts would later discover that she had tried to cover her head with her hands, and defensive wounds remained on her hands, indicating that she saw the killer and tried to defend herself. Little Kazilia was also killed with monstrous cruelty. A fragile child's skull could not withstand such blows. After this, the killer entered the house. Inside were the new-made Maria Baumgartner and 2-year-old baby Joseph. Maria probably heard the noise and came out to see what was happening, or the killer came for her himself. She was killed in her room with the same tool, with the same brutal blows to the head. Her body would later be found on the bed, in a pool of blood that had soaked through the mattress and was dripping onto the floor. But the story with little Joseph is perhaps the most horrifying detail of this entire nightmare. The 2-year-old child was not killed immediately. When forensic experts performed the autopsy, they discovered that the boy lived for several more hours after the attack. Partially digested food was found in his stomach, and in his crib were traces that he had been crying, moving, possibly calling for his mother. The killer had struck him on the head, but the blows were not immediately fatal. The child slowly died in his crib, possibly over several agonizing hours, bleeding out. This means the killer either didn't check whether the child was dead or deliberately left him to die a slow death. Forensic experts noted that the baby literally bit his own hair from pain and terror, indicating his agony. 6 people, the entire family, including the new maid who simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, all killed with monstrous cruelty, with a pickaxe-matic, a tool that required considerable physical strength to inflict such devastating blows. The crime was committed with calculation. The killer methodically dispatched all family members, leaving no one alive who could tell about what happened. But what happened after the murder is possibly even more frightening than the crime itself, because the killer didn't leave the farm. He stayed. He stayed to live in a house where he had just killed 6 people, where the bodies still retained warmth, where blood had not yet dried on the floor and walls. And he remained there not for 1 hour and not for 1 day. By all indications, the killer spent several days on the farm after the murder, calmly going about daily business. When the police finally arrived at the farm and began their inspection, they discovered a number of details that indicated someone's presence in the house after the murders had been committed. First, the livestock had been fed. The cows had been milked. The animals had received food and water. This meant that someone had been caring for the farm for at least a day or 2 after the murder. Moreover, neighbors told police they had seen smoke rising from the chimney of the Gruber house in the days after the murder. This meant that someone was heating the stove, cooking food, warming themselves. Someone was living in this house, surrounded by corpses. Investigators also discovered that someone had been eating in the house. In the kitchen were traces of food preparation, dirty dishes, food remnants. Someone had been cooking themselves breakfast, lunch, and dinner, sleeping, possibly in one of the beds, while in other rooms and in the barn lay the stiffened bodies of the people he had killed. This fact is so monstrous and inexplicable from the standpoint of normal human psychology that many researchers consider it key to understanding the killer's personality. What kind of person is capable of this? What kind of cold-bloodedness? What pathological insensitivity is required to calmly live in a house full of corpses, do household chores, cook food, feed livestock? Some neighbors also reported seeing light in the farm windows on the night after the murder. Someone was walking through the house with a lamp or candle, and this light was visible from afar. One witness even claimed to have seen the shadow of a person passing by the window. But no one paid attention to this because everyone thought it was someone from the Gruber family. It couldn't have occurred to anyone that the entire family was already dead and their killer was walking through the house. Another detail confirming the killer's presence in the house after the crime is the condition of the bodies. When they were discovered, some bodies were partially covered, as if someone had tried to hide them or simply move them aside so they wouldn't be in the way. The bodies of Andreas and Kazilia in the barn were covered with straw and hay. This wasn't an attempt at burial, rather a careless concealment so they wouldn't catch the eye. And the maid Maria lay in her bed, and someone had covered her body with a blanket, as if she were simply sleeping. There's also a version, based on neighbors' testimony, that someone saw an unfamiliar person in the area of the farm a day or two after the presumed date of the murder, but this person didn't arouse suspicion and wasn't stopped. The description was extremely vague. A middle-aged man in dark clothing, nothing special. This could have been anyone, a laborer, a traveler, a neighbor from a distant village, or the killer who had finally left the farm after spending several days there. The bodies were discovered only on April 4th, 1922, that is 4 days after the presumed date of the murder. Why so long? It all had to do with the farm's isolation and the fact that the Gruber family was not particularly sociable and didn't have regular contact with neighbors. The first to become concerned was a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who hadn't seen anyone from the Gruber family for several days. Usually Andreas or Victoria appeared in the village to buy necessary goods or simply showed themselves to neighbors. But this time several days had passed in complete silence. On April 2nd, little Kazilia was supposed to go to school, but didn't show up. The teacher didn't attach importance to this, deciding the girl was sick. But when the child wasn't there the next day either, she sent a note to the parents, but received no response. Then she told about her concern in the village, and several men, including Lorenz Schlittenbauer, decided to visit the farm and check if everything was all right. On April 4th, a small group of men came to the Hinterkaifeck farm. The first thing they noticed was the ominous silence. No sounds of voices, no dog barking, nothing. But the livestock in the barn were alive and mooing, demanding food, which was strange. Usually Andreas never forgot about the animals. The house door was unlocked, which also seemed unusual. The men entered the yard and began looking around. Schlittenbauer was the first to enter the barn and saw something that made his blood run cold. Under a pile of hay and straw, human feet were visible. He threw aside the hay and discovered the bodies of Andreas and Kazilia Gruber, mutilated and stiff. Nearby lay the bodies of Victoria and little Kazilia. The men immediately rushed into the house and discovered the body of the maid Maria in her room and the body of little Joseph in the baby crib. The entire family was dead. The horror experienced by those who found them is difficult to describe in words. One of the men immediately ran to the nearest village to call the police and a doctor, although it was obvious that no doctor could help anymore. The police arrived from Munich quite quickly, considering the scale of the crime. The farm was cordoned off. An investigation began. The forensic medical expert established the approximate time of death, the evening of March 31st or the early night of April 1st. The cause of death for all 6 victims, multiple blunt force trauma to the skull, inflicted by a heavy object with a sharp edge, identified as a pickaxe-matic. The murder weapon was found in the barn. It belonged to the farm itself. On it remained traces of blood, hair, and brain tissue. The investigation of the murders on the Hinterkaifeck farm became one of the most extensive in the history of Bavaria at that time. The best detectives and criminologists were brought to the case. Hundreds of witnesses were questioned. Dozens of versions were checked. But the more investigators delved into the case, the more confusing and mysterious it became. There wasn't a single lead that would have led to a specific suspect. No convincing evidence was found. The killers seemed to have dissolved into thin air, leaving behind nothing but 6 mutilated bodies and many frightening unanswered questions. The first and most obvious version that investigators considered was robbery. Perhaps someone knew that the Gruber family kept a significant sum of money at home and decided to rob them, then killed all the witnesses. But this version was quickly rejected. The fact is that when inspecting the house, police found all valuables untouched, including a significant sum of money that Andreas Gruber kept in the house, about 900 German marks, which at that time was quite a substantial sum. The money lay in plain sight, in a cabinet, and the killer, who spent several days in the house, couldn't have failed to notice it but didn't take it. Also, no valuable items, tools, or livestock were stolen. The robbery motive was excluded. The second version concerned family relations and those dark rumors that circulated around the Gruber family. Investigators turned their attention to the incest charges brought against Andreas Gruber. Perhaps the murder was committed by someone who wanted to punish Andreas for his alleged crimes, or perhaps it was revenge from someone connected to the family. The police began checking everyone who had any connections to the Gruber family, including distant relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances. Particular attention was paid to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who first discovered the bodies. First, he showed suspicious knowledge of the situation on the farm. When he came there with other men, he seemed to already know where to look for the bodies and headed straight to the barn where they were located. Second, there were rumors that it was Schlittenbauer who was the real father of little Joseph, Victoria's son, and that he had a relationship with Victoria before or after her husband's death in the war. If this was true, Schlittenbauer could have had a motive for murder. For example, Andreas might have threatened to reveal this connection or somehow blackmail him. Schlittenbauer was subjected to intense interrogations, checked again and again, but no convincing evidence of his guilt was found. He claimed that although he had friendly relations with Victoria, he was never in an intimate relationship with her, and that Joseph was not his son. He had an alibi for the evening of March 31st. He claimed he was at home with his family, and his wife and children confirmed this. But investigators weren't completely convinced. An alibi from family members wasn't considered absolutely reliable, especially in a small Bavarian village where family loyalty was above all. The third version concerned vagrants and random criminals. At that time, Many homeless and destitute people wandered throughout Germany. Many of them were World War I veterans, psychologically traumatized and desperate. Perhaps one of these people wandered onto the farm, asked for food or lodging, was refused, and decided to take revenge. But this version also didn't hold up to scrutiny. First, a vagrant wouldn't have stayed on the farm for several days after the murder, risking being caught. Second, the crime required knowledge of the farm's layout, the family's habits, which would have been impossible for a random passerby. Third, a vagrant would certainly have stolen the money and valuables, which he left untouched. As the investigation reached a dead end, increasingly dark and conspiratorial versions began to appear. One of them was connected to sectarians and occult groups that were believed to operate in Bavaria in those years. Some researchers suggested that the murder could have been ritual connected to some dark rites. This version seemed to be supported by the monstrous cruelty of the murder and the fact that the killer stayed to live in the house with corpses, behavior that didn't fit within the framework of an ordinary criminal crime. But no concrete evidence of the existence of such cults in the area was found, and this version remained pure speculation. Another version was connected to political motives. Germany in the early 1920s was experiencing a period of enormous political upheaval. World War I had recently ended. The country was devastated by reparations. The economy was collapsing. Poverty and despair reigned everywhere. Various political groups became active in the country. Communists, nationalists, monarchists, each pulling the blanket their way. Perhaps the Gruber family was involved in some political affairs or conflicts. Maybe Andreas was an informant or, conversely, was hiding someone. But this version also found no confirmation. The Gruber family was as isolated and apolitical as was possible for a peasant family of that time. There were also versions connected to revenge. Perhaps Andreas Gruber had enemies that no one knew about. Maybe he owed someone a large sum of money or was involved in some criminal activity. Investigators carefully checked the family's financial situation, all their transactions and contacts, but found nothing suspicious. Andreas was an ordinary, though quite prosperous peasant who kept to himself and didn't get involved in any dark dealings. One of the most sinister details discovered by investigators concerned the house's attic. Remember that the previous maid complained about strange sounds from the attic, and Andreas himself told neighbors that he heard footsteps overhead. When police carefully examined the attic, they found traces of a person's prolonged stay there. It was literally like a small nest, flattened hay, food remnants, even cigarette butts. Someone really had been living in this attic, possibly for weeks or even months, watching the family below, studying their routine, planning the murder. This discovery confirmed the worst fears. The killer really had been hiding in the house long before committing the crime. But who was this person? How was he able to secretly penetrate the attic and live there without being discovered? The attic could only be reached by ladder, and any movement there created noise. The family heard these sounds, but when they checked, they found no one. Does this mean the stranger was hiding somewhere in a secluded place in the attic when they searched for him? Or did he somehow leave the attic and return there through an external entrance that the family didn't know about? Investigators also wondered about the bunch of keys that disappeared shortly before the murder. If the killer stole the keys, this meant he could freely enter and exit the house without attracting attention. This explained how he could live in the attic while going outside to satisfy his needs or to avoid being caught during a search. But the keys were never found, neither on the farm nor anywhere else. The best forensic experts in Germany at the time were brought in to investigate the Hinterkaifeck murders. A relatively new technology at that time was applied, removing the victims' skulls to create reconstructions and study the nature of the injuries in more detail. This was done not only to establish the exact picture of the murder, but also in the hope that someday in the future this evidence would help find the killer. The skulls of the 6 victims were removed and sent to Munich to the Forensic Medical Institute, where they were carefully studied. The examination confirmed that all victims were killed by blows from a blunt object with a sharp edge, a pickaxe mattock. The blows were delivered with enormous force, and the killer struck not once or twice, but repeatedly, as if in rage or seeking to guarantee death. On the skulls of Andreas and Kazilia were multiple fractures. Some blows literally split the bone. On Victoria's hands, they found defensive wounds, indicating that she tried to shield herself from the blows. Little Kazilia's skull was shattered by several blows. The most tragic finding concerned little Joseph. Experts established that the boy received blows to the head, but they were not instantly fatal. Analysis of the stomach contents showed that he had eaten about an hour before receiving the injuries, and then lived for several more hours, gradually losing consciousness from internal bleeding and brain swelling. Experts also discovered that the child, while in agony, was biting his own hair, a sign of unbearable pain and suffering. This meant that the killer either didn't know the child was still alive or deliberately left him to die a slow death. Both options are equally monstrous. As for the murder weapon, the pickaxe mattock found in the barn was carefully examined. Traces of blood, hair, and brain tissue particles were indeed found on it, confirming that this was the tool used. But no fingerprints remained on it. Either the killer wore gloves or simply carefully wiped the tool after use. In those years, fingerprinting was just beginning to enter criminologist practice, and equipment for taking and analyzing prints wasn't as sophisticated as now, so the absence of prints wasn't unusual. They also tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that night, based on the location of the bodies and the nature of the wounds. Investigators concluded that the killer attacked Andreas and Kazilia in the barn first, then ambushed or met Victoria and little Kazilia when they were going to the barn or returning from it, and killed them in the yard or near the house. Then he entered the house, where he killed the maid Maria and struck Joseph. All this took probably no more than half an hour. The killer acted quickly, decisively, without hesitation. During the investigation, more than 100 people were questioned. All neighbors, family acquaintances, people who had any dealings with the Grubers. Several people came under particular suspicion and were subjected to intense interrogations. Besides the already mentioned Lorenz Schlittenbauer, several other people fell under suspicion. One of them was a worker named Carl Gabriel, who worked for some time on the Gruber farm as a hired helper. He left them after a conflict with Andreas Gruber over payment for work. Neighbors reported that Gabriel left in anger and threatened revenge. Police tracked him down and questioned him, but his alibi proved solid. On the night of the murder, he was in another city many kilometers from the farm, which was confirmed by numerous witnesses. Moreover, Gabriel was a rather frail man, and experts doubted he would have had the physical strength to deliver such devastating blows. Another suspect was a vagrant who was seen in the vicinity of the farm about a week before the murder. He asked for alms and lodging at several houses in the area, but was refused everywhere. Police announced a search for this man, but were never able to find him. He disappeared as if he had dissolved into thin air. Was he involved in the murders? Or was it just a coincidence that he passed by shortly before the tragedy? An answer to this question was never found. They also checked the version that the killer could have been the husband of the previous maid who quit 6 months before the murder because of strange sounds in the attic. For some reason, investigators thought her husband might have harbored a grudge against the Gruber family, possibly believing his wife had been mistreated there. But this version proved completely groundless. The husband was a respectable man with no criminal past, and on the night of the murder, he was at work, which was confirmed by documentation. There were even versions that the killer could have been someone from the family's distant relatives, claiming inheritance or property of the farm. But checking all relatives yielded no results. All of them had alibis, and none had a strong enough motive to commit such a monstrous crime. As all rational versions fell away one after another, investigators increasingly leaned toward the idea that the crime was committed by a mentally ill person, possibly someone suffering from a severe mental disorder. Several factors spoke in favor of this version. First, the excessive cruelty of the murder. The killer delivered multiple blows, continuing to beat already dead or dying people, which indicates rage or complete lack of self-control. Second, the killer remained living in the house with corpses for several days, which is absolutely abnormal behavior, even for a hardened criminal. This could indicate a complete lack of empathy or a serious mental deviation that didn't allow the killer to adequately perceive reality. In those years in Germany, there were many World War I veterans, many of whom suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of them experienced hallucinations, fits of rage, lost touch with reality. Could one of these people have been the killer? Investigators tried to check all known mentally ill people in the area, contacted psychiatric clinics, checked lists of veterans, but found no one who fit the description. There was even a version that the killer could have been an escaped patient from a psychiatric hospital, but checks showed that in the period from late March to early April 1922, not a single escape from psychiatric institutions in Bavaria was registered. The investigation continued for months, then years. Police checked thousands of leads, questioned hundreds of people, searched through all archives looking for any information that could shed light on this case. Rewards were offered for information that would help find the killer. Newspapers throughout Germany wrote about the Hinterkaifeck case, and it became one of the most famous unsolved crimes in the country. But despite all efforts, the killer was never found. Over time, the investigation quieted down. Investigators moved on to other cases. Public interest gradually waned. The Hinterkaifeck farm was demolished in 1923, just a year after the tragedy. Local residents didn't want this place to become an object of morbid curiosity, and the building was dismantled and the land resold. Today, other buildings stand in that place, and only a small memorial reminds that once one of the most terrible tragedies in German history occurred here. The victims' skulls, which were removed for forensic examination, were stored in the archives of the Forensic Medical Institute in Munich for decades. They were periodically requested by researchers, journalists, criminologists, hoping that new technologies would help solve the mystery. But time passed, and no solution was found. The skulls were finally buried only in the 1980s, when it was decided that further storage of them made no sense. In recent decades, interest in the Hinterkaifeck case has risen again. Modern criminologists, using new technologies and methods, have attempted several times to review the case and find a solution. In 2007, students at the Police Academy of Fürstenfeldbruck conducted a large-scale training investigation of the case using modern forensic methods. They reviewed all available materials, analyzed witness statements, tried to build a profile of the killer. The students concluded that the killer was most likely someone who knew the farm and the Gruber family well. It was a local resident or someone who had regular contact with the family. The killer was a physically strong man, probably between 30 and 50 years old. He was familiar with the way of life on the farm, knew where money and valuables were stored, but didn't take them, which indicates that the motive was not robbery. Perhaps it was revenge or some personal grievance. The students also suggested the version that the killer could have suffered from a mental disorder that allowed him to plan the crime, as evidenced by the fact that he lived in the attic studying the family, but at the same time lose self-control at the moment of murder, as evidenced by excessive cruelty, and behave absolutely irrationally after the crime, remaining to live in the house with corpses. But even with the application of modern methods, the students couldn't point to a specific suspect. Too much time had passed, too many witnesses had died, too much evidence had been lost or damaged. The Hinterkaifeck case remains unsolved and most likely will remain so forever. Over the past decades, many theories have emerged around the Hinterkaifeck case, some of which border on conspiracy theories and paranormal speculation. Let's examine the main ones. Theory 1. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Despite the fact that the official investigation couldn't prove his guilt, many researchers still consider him the main suspect. In favor of this version is the fact that he was well acquainted with the family, had access to the farm, possibly had an intimate relationship with Victoria, and could have been Joseph's father. If Andreas Gruber threatened to reveal this connection or blackmailed Schlittenbauer, the latter had a motive for murder. Also suspicious is his behavior when discovering the bodies. He seemed to know exactly where to look for them. However, against this version is the fact that Schlittenbauer would hardly have stayed living in the house after the murder. It would have been too risky, considering he lived nearby and his absence from home would have been noticed. Theory 2. Unknown vagrant or mentally ill person. This version explains the killer's irrational behavior after the crime. Perhaps it was someone who wandered around the area, suffered from a mental disorder, saw the farm, and decided he had a right to it. He penetrated the attic, lived there for some time studying the family, and then, in a fit of madness or rage, killed everyone. After the murder, he stayed living in the house because his sick consciousness saw nothing abnormal in this. Then, when he ran out of food or simply got bored, he left and dissolved somewhere in Germany or even left the country. This version explains much, but doesn't explain how such a person could remain unnoticed in the attic for so long and why he left no traces of his identity. Theory 3. Someone from distant relatives or family acquaintances whom the police didn't know about. Perhaps Andreas or Victoria had connections or conflicts that the family didn't tell even their closest neighbors about. Maybe Andreas owed someone a large sum of money that he couldn't or didn't want to repay. Or Victoria had a relationship with someone who was jealous of her or wanted revenge. This version is difficult to verify because everyone who could have known such details has long since died. Theory 4. Political or ideological motive. In the early 1920s, political chaos reigned in Germany, and various groups waged fierce struggles among themselves. Perhaps the Gruber family was somehow connected to one of these groups, or one of the family members was an informant, or conversely, was hiding someone wanted by the authorities. The murder could have been revenge or intimidation. But this version seems unlikely, considering the isolation and apolitical nature of the Gruber family. Theory 5. Ritual murder. Some researchers of paranormal phenomena suggested that the murder could have been committed as part of some occult ritual. In favor of this version, they claim is the symbolic number of victims, 6, excessive cruelty, and the fact that the killer stayed living among the corpses, as if performing some ritual. However, there is no evidence of the existence of such cults in Bavaria at that time, and this version remains pure speculation. Modern criminal psychologists who studied the Hinterkaifeck case tried to compile a profile of the killer based on his actions and behavior. Here's what they suggest. The killer was a man, probably between 30 and 50 years old, physically strong and resilient. He possessed the ability to plan and patience, as evidenced by the fact that he lived in the attic observing the family, probably for weeks. This indicates a certain level of intelligence and self-control. However, at the moment of murder, he showed extreme cruelty and possibly lost control of himself, which may indicate psychopathic personality traits or a state of strong emotional arousal. The fact that the killer stayed living in the house after the crime suggests several possible things. First, he could have suffered from a serious mental disorder that didn't allow him to adequately perceive what was happening. Second, he could have been an absolute sociopath, devoid of empathy and normal human emotions, for whom corpses were no more than inanimate objects. Third, he could have experienced some perverted sense of satisfaction or power from living in a house full of his victims. The fact that the killer didn't take money and valuables indicates that the motive was not robbery. Perhaps it was revenge, hatred, or some personal satisfaction he received from committing the crime. Or perhaps he simply didn't need money because he had his own source of income. The killer was most likely familiar with the farm and the family. He knew the layout of the buildings, the family's daily routine, where the money and valuables were located. This could have been a neighbor, acquaintance, distant relative, or someone who had previously worked on the farm. After committing the crime, the killer probably left the area and possibly left Bavaria altogether. He could have changed his appearance, taken another name, started a new life somewhere else. Or he could have died shortly after the crime, from illness, accident, or even suicide, which would explain why he was never found. Let's stop for a minute and remember the victims of this monstrous crime. 6 people, elderly spouses Andreas and Kazilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria, 2 small children Kazilia and Joseph, and the maid Maria Baumgartner, who simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. All of them were brutally murdered, and their lives were cut short in one terrible evening. The Gruber family was buried in a cemetery in a neighboring settlement, but without their skulls, which were removed for forensic examination. Only decades later were the skulls buried, and the victims finally found peace. A monument with an inscription was erected on their grave, but over time it deteriorated and was replaced with a modern memorial. At the site of the former Hinterkaifeck farm today stands a memorial sign with a brief description of the tragedy. This place is periodically visited by tourists, true crime enthusiasts, and paranormal researchers. Some of the latter claim that this place possesses negative energy and that one can feel the presence of the spirits of the murdered. But these are, of course, unprovable claims. The Hinterkaifeck case had a significant impact on the development of criminology in Germany. This was one of the first cases in which forensic medical methods were so actively used, including the removal of skulls for analysis. This case showed the importance of preserving physical evidence and carefully documenting the crime scene. The case also became part of popular culture. Books were written about it, documentary films were made, episodes and crime shows were dedicated to it. In Germany, it remains one of the most famous unsolved crimes, along with the Zodiac case in the USA or the Jack the Ripper case in Great Britain. Many writers and screenwriters used the Hinterkaifeck case as a basis for their works. Crime novels were written, feature films were made, theatrical productions were created. Some of these works offer their own versions of solving the mystery, although, of course, they all remain in the realm of artistic fiction. There are several reasons why the Hinterkaifeck case remains unsolved more than 100 years after the tragedy. First, this was a time when criminology was just beginning to develop as a science. There was no DNA analysis, computer databases, modern identification methods. Investigators relied mainly on witness testimony and physical evidence, of which there was extremely little in this case. Second, the crime scene was isolated, and the crime was discovered only several days after it was committed. During this time, the killer could have destroyed or altered many pieces of evidence, left the area, gone to another city, or even country. Third, in those years, Germany was experiencing a period of chaos and devastation after World War I. Police were overloaded with work, resources were insufficient, many archives and documents were lost or damaged. Moreover, thousands of homeless people and refugees wander the country, making tracking suspects extremely difficult. Fourth, the absence of an obvious motive for the crime. This was not a robbery. There was no obvious revenge or jealousy. The killer took nothing valuable, left no messages or demands. This made constructing theories extremely difficult. And finally, time. More than 100 years have passed. All participants in the events, all witnesses, all investigators have long since died. Many documents and case materials have been lost or destroyed. The victims' skulls, which could have been subjected to modern DNA analysis, were buried. The crime scene was demolished. Any physical evidence disappeared long ago. Even if we knew who the killer was, proving it now would be impossible. The Hinterkaifeck case reminds us how important it is to be vigilant and not ignore alarming signals. The Gruber family heard strange sounds, saw tracks in the snow, discovered missing keys. All these were signs that something was wrong, that someone was invading their space. But they didn't seek help, didn't call police, didn't strengthen security measures. Perhaps if they had done so, the tragedy could have been avoided. This case also shows how dangerous isolation and remoteness from other people can be. In the modern world, with mobile phones and fast communication, such a tragedy would have been discovered much faster. But in 1922, the Hinterkaifeck farm was literally cut off from the world, and no one knew about the horror happening there for several days. The case also reminds us that some crimes can remain unsolved forever, despite all the efforts of police and investigators. This doesn't mean they shouldn't be investigated or that attempts to find the truth should be abandoned. But it's a reminder of the imperfection of our justice system and that evil sometimes remains unpunished. There's one more version we haven't talked about in detail yet, but which cannot be completely excluded. The version that the killer could have been someone from the family itself. Although at first glance, this seems incredible. Considering all family members perished, let's consider this possibility. Theoretically, one family member could have killed the others and then committed suicide, but in such a way that it looked like murder. But this version doesn't hold up for several reasons. First, the forensic examination clearly established that all victims were killed by another person's hands, not by suicide. Second, the nature of the wounds and their location exclude the possibility of suicide. Third, after the murder, someone continued to live in the house, feed the livestock, cook food. Dead people couldn't do this. However, there's another variant of this version. What if Victoria or even Andreas were accomplices of the killer? What if they helped someone penetrate the farm, provided access to the attic, and then this person killed them along with everyone else. This would explain how the killer knew the farm's layout and the family's routine so well. But this is pure speculation, not supported by any evidence. The murders at the Hinterkaifeck farm remain one of the darkest and most mysterious pages in German criminal history. This is a story about monstrous cruelty, about a family that was destroyed in one night, about a mystery that hasn't been solved in more than 100 years. This is a story that makes us think about the nature of evil, about what a person is capable of, about how easily life can be cut short. We will probably never know who the killer was. All traces have long gone cold. All witnesses have died. All evidence has been lost. But the memory of the victims lives on, and their story continues to stir the minds of people around the world. The Hinterkaifeck case reminds us that even in a peaceful Bavarian village, among fields and forests, a tragedy can unfold that will shock an entire country. This was a case that changed the approach to criminology in Germany, a case that spawned countless theories and speculations, a case that became part of the country's cultural heritage. And as long as people are interested in unsolved crimes and mysteries of the past, the Hinterkaifeck story will live on, reminding us that not all mysteries are solved, and not all criminals are destined to be punished. 6 people, 1 farm, 1 night of horror, and a mystery that has given no peace for more than a century. Over the decades since the tragedy, other, less-known versions of what happened have emerged. Some of them are based on fragmentary evidence, others on logical constructions by modern researchers. Let's examine them in more detail. One such version is connected to the possible involvement of Victoria's former lover or her secret lover. Victoria became a widow after World War I, and although officially she lived with her parents and children, it's quite possible she had romantic relationships that the family either didn't know about or hid from outsiders. In a conservative Bavarian village of the early 20s, extramarital affairs were subject to serious condemnation, and the family could have carefully guarded such a secret. Imagine the situation. Victoria had a lover, possibly a married man from a neighboring village or town. They met secretly, and this person knew the farm well, perhaps even visited there under some pretext. But then something went wrong. Perhaps Victoria wanted to break off the relationship, or the lover learned she was seeing someone else, or Andreas discovered this connection and threatened exposure. In a fit of jealousy, fear, or rage, this person could have decided on murder. This version would explain why the killer knew the farm so well and why he hid in the attic. Perhaps he came there at night for meetings with Victoria and knew all the secluded corners of the house. This would also explain the disappearance of the keys. Perhaps Victoria herself gave them to him for secret visits. But after some conflict or breakup, he decided to take revenge and destroy the entire family so that no witnesses to their connection remained. However, against this version is the fact that all family members were killed, including small children and the maid, who had nothing to do with the supposed love drama. This indicates either extreme cruelty of the killer or that the motive was different. Another interesting version is connected to military past. Germany had just survived World War I, and thousands of soldiers returned home from the front. Many of them were psychologically traumatized, had seen the horrors of war, become accustomed to death and violence. Some returned home to discover their families had fallen apart. Wives had left for others. Homes were destroyed. These people were often embittered, desperate. Some suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Victoria's husband died in the war. But what if he had a comrade in arms, a friend, a trench companion who promised that if something happened, he would take care of the family. What if this person returned from the war, found Victoria, came to the farm, but was met coldly or hostilely? Andreas Gruber, as we remember, was a withdrawn and unwelcoming person. Perhaps he drove the veteran away, not wanting to accept a stranger in the house, or insulted him in some way. The veteran, psychologically unstable after the horrors of war, could have perceived this as a betrayal of his fallen friend's memory. He could have harbored a grudge, begun watching the farm, planning revenge. A man who had gone through the trenches of the Western Front was accustomed to death, accustomed to killing, and for him to deliver deadly blows to 6 people might not have been such an impossible thing. Military training would also explain the physical strength and determination with which the murders were committed. After committing the crime, such a person could have stayed on the farm simply because for him it was something like a return to normal life. He fed the livestock, cooked food, lived in the house. Perhaps in his sick mind he had taken the place of the farm's master, the place of his fallen friend. And the corpses around him were no more frightening than the hundreds and thousands of dead bodies he had seen in the trenches. This version has a certain logic, but against it is the fact that police carefully checked all known veterans who had any connection with the Gruber family or Victoria's deceased husband, and found no one suspicious. Perhaps this person hid his connection to the family, or records of him were lost in the chaos of the post-war years. There's also a version according to which the murder was contract killing, committed by a professional or semi-professional killer. In favor of this version is the methodical nature with which all family members were killed, the absence of robbery attempts, careful planning, living in the attic, studying the family's daily routine. But who could have ordered such a murder and why? One hypothesis is connected to land disputes. In those times, land was the main wealth of peasants, and disputes over plot boundaries, inheritance, or debts sometimes led to serious conflicts. Perhaps the Gruber family had a dispute with neighbors or distant relatives over ownership of the farm or land plots. Someone could have hired a person to eliminate the entire family to gain rights to the land. But a thorough check of all land documents and inheritance cases revealed no serious disputes or conflicts that could have led to such a monstrous crime. The Hinterkaifeck farm after the Gruber family's death was sold, and the money was distributed among distant relatives, but none of them were noticed attempting to obtain this property before the murder. Another variant of this version is connected to financial affairs. Perhaps Andreas Gruber was involved in some shadow financial operations, lent money at interest, engaged in usury, or had debts to someone influential. In post-war Germany, where poverty and despair reigned, such operations were common. Perhaps Andreas couldn't repay a debt or, conversely, demanded debt repayment from a person who couldn't but didn't want to pay. This person could have hired a killer to eliminate the creditor. But again, checking the Gruber family's financial affairs revealed nothing suspicious. Andreas ran a fairly modest household, had some savings, but there are no signs that he engaged in usury or large financial operations. One of the most intriguing details of the case is the story of the previous maid who quit 6 months before the murder, complaining about strange sounds from the attic and the feeling that someone was watching her. This woman could have shed light on many mysteries of the case, but unfortunately, her testimony was quite vague. She told that she often heard footsteps and creaking floorboards in the attic, especially at night. She felt that someone was walking there, right above her room, but when she told Andreas Gruber about it, he either brushed it off or went up to check himself and found no one. One night, She woke up from the sensation of someone's presence in the room and, as she claimed, saw the dark silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. She screamed, and the silhouette disappeared. The next morning, she packed her things and left, despite persuasion to stay in good pay. This story confirms that someone really was hiding in the attic long before the murder. But who was it? And why didn't he kill the maid when she discovered him? Perhaps he wasn't ready for murder yet, was still studying the situation, planning. Or perhaps he didn't want to attract attention with a premature attack. It's also interesting that the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the farm literally a few hours before the murder. She came on March 31st in the afternoon, and that same evening the tragedy occurred. Some researchers believe her arrival could have been a trigger for the murder. Perhaps the killer was waiting until there were no outsiders on the farm, until the old maid left, and there would be no one who could interfere. But the arrival of the new maid disrupted his plans, and he was forced to act immediately before the new woman could settle in and understand that something strange was happening on the farm. Or perhaps the killer was waiting specifically for the new maid's arrival because he wanted to kill everyone who was on the farm at that moment. This would explain why he hesitated so long. He was waiting for all the victims to gather. The personality of Andreas Gruber remains one of the key mysteries of this case. What do we know about him? A stern 63-year-old peasant, withdrawn, unwelcoming, suspicious. A man against whom charges of an incestuous relationship with his own daughter were brought. A man who heard strange sounds, saw tracks in the snow, discovered missing keys, but for some reason didn't go to the police, didn't strengthen security measures, didn't ask neighbors for help. Why? What was he hiding? Maybe he really did have something to hide. His relationship with his daughter, some financial manipulations, some dark deeds from the past. And when strange incidents began, he couldn't turn to the authorities because he feared that an investigation would bring his secrets to light. Or perhaps Andreas knew who was hiding in the attic and for some reason didn't want or couldn't turn him in. Maybe it was someone he knew, someone he owed something to, or someone he feared. Perhaps this person was blackmailing him, threatening to reveal some compromising information, and Andreas was forced to tolerate his presence on the farm. There's even a version that Andreas himself let the killer into the house, possibly not knowing about his intentions. Maybe it was an old acquaintance who came under a plausible pretext, and Andreas, unknowingly, led into his house his own death and the death of his entire family. Let's try to imagine the atmosphere that prevailed on the farm in the last days before the murder. Andreas is disturbed. He saw tracks in the snow, hears strange sound from the attic, discovered missing keys. He tells his wife and daughter about this. Perhaps they too are frightened, but try to remain calm for the children's sake. Kazilia Sr., a 62-year-old woman who had lived her whole life on this farm, suddenly feels that her home is no longer a safe place. Victoria, a 35-year-old widow who had already lost her husband in the war, now fears for her children. She listens to every sound, flinches at every creak. 7-year-old Kazilia perhaps senses the adult's tension but doesn't understand its cause. 2-year-old Joseph is too small to understand anything. He continues to play, demand attention, live his childish life, not knowing that he has only a few days left to live. The previous maid left because she could no longer endure the atmosphere of fear. Now a new one arrives, Maria Baumgartner. She comes from another village, doesn't know the farm's history, doesn't know about the strange incidents. She enters a house where in a few hours she will become a victim of a monstrous murder. Imagine her first impressions: a new place, new employers, a slightly anxious atmosphere that she perhaps attributes to her own nervousness in a new place. And somewhere upstairs, in the attic, perhaps at this very moment, the killer lurks, having already sharpened his pickaxe-matic and waiting for darkness to fall. The evening of March 31st. The sun sets below the horizon. Andreas and Kazilia go to the barn for evening farm chores. They don't know they will never return to the house alive. Victoria is perhaps preparing dinner in the kitchen. Little Kazilia is playing somewhere nearby. Joseph has already been put to bed in his crib. Maria is going about her business in the house, perhaps unpacking things, settling into the new place. And at this moment, the nightmare begins. From the darkness, from the barn, from the attic, from somewhere the killer appears. Perhaps Andreas is the first to see him, recognizes him, or doesn't recognize him. Perhaps tries to say something, scream, defend himself. But the pickaxe-matic already descends on his head with monstrous force, and his scream breaks off. Kazilia turns toward the sound, sees her husband falling into bloody straw, sees a figure with a raised tool, and this is the last thing she sees in her life. Let's try to reconstruct the last minutes of each victim based on forensic data and investigation. This will be difficult, but it's important to understand the scale of the tragedy and the monstrosity of the crime. Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, head of the family. He's in the barn, perhaps feeding livestock or checking feed supplies. The killer sneaks up from behind or meets him face to face. Andreas perhaps tries to speak, asks what's happening, but the killer doesn't answer. The first blow with the pickaxe-matic strikes the head from the side or behind. Andreas falls. Second blow. Third. Fourth. The killer strikes again and again until he's convinced the victim is dead. Andreas's face turns into a bloody mess. His skull is shattered. He dies quickly, perhaps not even having time to understand what happened. Kazilia Gruber, 62 years old, Andreas's wife. She's next to her husband in the barn. Hears the blow, turns, sees the nightmare, perhaps screams. The killer pounces on her too. She tries to run, but where? The barn is closed. The exit is behind the killer. Blows rain down on her head, shoulders back. She falls next to her husband's body. Her blood mixes with his blood on the straw. Victoria, 35 years old, daughter of Andreas and Kazilia, mother of 2 children. She perhaps hears noise from the barn, or notices that her parents haven't returned for a long time. She leaves the house, possibly with her 7-year-old daughter Kazilia. They go to the barn or meet the killer coming out of it. Victoria sees him, sees the bloodied pickaxe-matic in his hands, understands what happened. She instinctively shields her daughter, tries to protect the child. She raises her hands, trying to deflect the blows. Defensive wounds remain on her hands, deep cuts and fractures. But the pickaxe-matic is too heavy, the blows too strong. One blow breaks her arm. The second splits her skull. She falls, but even falling, tries to shield her daughter. Kazilia Jr., 7 years old, Andreas's granddaughter and Victoria's daughter. A little girl who was supposed to go to school the next day. She sees her mother being killed, sees blood, sees the monster with the pickaxe-matic. She screams, perhaps tries to run, but her small legs cannot outrun an adult. The killer catches up with her. A blow to the small head. The fragile child's skull cannot withstand it. The girl falls and doesn't get up again. Her short life breaks off on this cold March evening, a few meters from her mother's body. Maria Baumgartner, 44 years old, maid. She's in the house, in her room. Perhaps hears noise outside, screams, comes out to see what's happening. Or the killer himself enters the house, bloodied, with the pickaxe in his hands. Maria sees him, understands the danger, perhaps tries to close her room door, hide. But the killer bursts in. She screams, but no one hears her scream. All the neighbors are too far away. Blows rain down on her head. She falls on her bed, which she had just made after arriving at her new job. Her blood soaks through the mattress. A woman who was simply looking for work to feed herself becomes a random victim of madness. Joseph, 2 years old, Victoria's son, Andreas's grandson. The most tragic victim. The baby is sleeping or lying in his crib. The killer enters the nursery. What does he feel looking at the sleeping child? Regret? Hesitation? Or absolute indifference? He swings. The blow strikes the small head. But the blows aren't as strong as the previous ones, or the aim isn't as accurate. The child doesn't die immediately. He receives terrible injuries. Internal bleeding begins, brain swelling. The baby cries, moans, calls for his mother who will never come. He lies in his crib, bleeding out for several agonizing hours. From pain and despair, he bites his own hair. Gradually, he weakens, loses consciousness. And somewhere in the deep night or early morning, the small heart stops. A 2-year-old child dies alone, in darkness, in his crib, surrounded by corpses. This was the night of horror at the Hinterkaifeck farm. 6 lives were cut short in some 30 minutes of the killer's active actions, plus several hours of little Joseph's agony. And now, let's imagine what the killer did during the next several days he spent on the farm. This is perhaps one of the most chilling parts of this entire story, because the killer's behavior after committing the crime is so far beyond normal that it's difficult to comprehend. After all 6 people are dead, the killer looks around. Around him, corpses, blood, discretion. A normal person in such a situation would either go into shock or immediately flee. But not this killer. He stays. He methodically inspects the farm, checks if anyone is left alive. He finds little Joseph, still alive, but doesn't finish him off, either not noticing the child is alive or consciously leaving him to die slowly. Then the killer begins to tidy up. Not in the sense of destroying evidence. He doesn't wipe blood, doesn't hide the pickaxe, doesn't destroy traces. He tidies up in a domestic sense. He covers the bodies in the barn with straw so they don't catch the eye. He covers the maid's body on the bed with a blanket, as if putting her to sleep. Perhaps he does this instinctively, perhaps following some internal logic of his own, incomprehensible to normal people. Then he goes to the kitchen. He's hungry after his bloody work. He lights a fire in the stove, hence the smoke that neighbors saw in subsequent days. He cooks himself food, perhaps uses products that Victoria was preparing for the family dinner that never happened. He eats, calmly, methodically, then washes the dishes or leaves them dirty on the table. He behaves as if this is his house, as if he's the master here. The next day, he gets up, perhaps having slept in one of the beds, passes by the maid's corpse, by the crib with the dying or already dead child, goes to the barn. The cows are mooing. They need to be milked. They don't understand what happened. They just want their usual routine to continue. And the killer milks the cows. He feeds them, gives them water. He takes care of the animals as if he's always lived here, as if he's the real master of the farm. Perhaps he walks around the farm, inspects the property, goes into the house, cooks himself another meal, lights the stove again. Neighbors see smoke and think the Gruber family is home. Everything is normal. It doesn't occur to anyone to check because the Gruber family wasn't sociable, and the absence of contact for several days doesn't cause concern. The killer spends a second day on the farm. Third, perhaps even fourth. What does he do all this time? takes care of the livestock, eats, sleeps, perhaps walks through the rooms, examines the family's things, reads their letters, looks at photographs. What's going on in his head? What is he thinking about? Does he feel remorse? Fear of inevitable exposure? Or does he simply live in some separate world of his own, where the murder of 6 people is just an event that happened, and now life must go on? At night, he lights the fire again, and neighbors see light in the windows. One neighbor claimed to have seen the shadow of a person passing by the window. This was the killer's shadow, calmly walking through a house full of corpses, as if feeling no discomfort from this fact. Finally, on the 3rd or 4th day, the killer decides to leave. Why exactly then? Maybe he ran out of food. Maybe he simply got tired of the farm. Maybe he sensed that soon someone would come to check. He gets dressed, perhaps takes something with him. Not money, not valuables, maybe just food for the road or some clothing. He takes one last look at the house where he spent several days in the company of the dead, then calmly walks out the door, closes it behind him, and leaves. Walks along the same road he once came on. His tracks lead away from the farm and disappear, dissolve into the March air of Bavaria. The killer vanishes as if he never existed. Modern criminal psychologists who studied the Hinterkaifeck case try to understand what kind of person could commit such a crime and behave this way. Several independent experts came to similar conclusions. The killer was most likely a psychopath or sociopath, a person with serious impairments in empathy and social connections. Such people don't experience normal human emotions such as regret, guilt, attachment. For them, other people are simply objects that can be used or eliminated if they interfere with achieving goals. However, the killer was not a primitive criminal. The fact that he spent weeks or even months in the attic observing the family speaks to an ability for long-term planning and self-control. This requires a certain level of intelligence and discipline. The killer was patient. He waited for the right moment, didn't give himself away prematurely, despite the fact that the maid once almost discovered him. The excessive cruelty of the murder, multiple blows to the victims' heads, continuing to strike even after the victims were clearly dead, indicates strong emotions at the moment of the crime. This wasn't a cold-blooded execution, but a furious, almost ritual massacre. Perhaps the killer felt some strong hatred toward the Gruber family, or perhaps he was simply venting accumulated aggression and anger at the world around him. The behavior after the murder, living in a house with corpses, is a sign of either complete loss of connection with reality or absolute absence of normal human emotions. Most murderers, even the most brutal ones, feel discomfort being near their victims after committing a crime. They rush to leave the scene, get rid of bodies, hide evidence. But this killer was different. For him, corpses were no more frightening or unpleasant than furniture. Some experts suggest the killer could have suffered from dissociative disorder or schizophrenia. In such a state, a person can lose touch with reality, live in some internal world of their own. Perhaps in his consciousness, the Gruber family wasn't dead. They were simply sleeping, and he was temporarily managing their household while they rested. Such a distortion of perception would explain his behavior. Another version is that the killer was a war veteran with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. A person who went through the trenches of World War I was accustomed to death and destruction. For him, murder could have been simply an action, no more significant than all the killings he committed in the war. And living among corpses could have reminded him of the trenches, where soldiers often spent days and weeks next to the bodies of fallen comrades because there was no way to bury them. There are also several conspiracy theories connected to the Hinterkaifeck case. Although most of them have no serious basis, let's examine the most popular ones. The first theory claims the murder was committed by agents of some secret organization or intelligence service. In the early 1920s, Germany was full of various secret societies, paramilitary groups, agents of different countries. Perhaps the Gruber family accidentally witnessed something they shouldn't have seen, or one of the family members possessed information dangerous to certain circles. The murder was ordered, and a professional killer eliminated all witnesses. In favor of this theory, as its supporters claim, is the methodical nature of the murder and the killer's strange behavior after the crime. Perhaps he remained on the farm to make sure no one survived and to find and destroy some documents or objects. But against this theory is the complete absence of any evidence that the Gruber family was connected to any secret affairs or possessed dangerous information. The second conspiracy theory is connected to the Nazis. Although in 1922 the Nazi Party was just beginning to gain strength, some researchers suggest the murder could have been connected to early actions of Nazi groups in Bavaria. Perhaps the Gruber family was connected to their political opponents, or Andreas refused to support the Nazis financially or in some other way. But this theory seems completely far-fetched and is not supported by any facts. The third theory claims that police actually knew who the killer was, but for some reason didn't pursue him. Perhaps the killer was someone influential or well-connected, and the investigation was deliberately sabotaged. Or perhaps the killer died shortly after the crime, and police decided to close the case without publicizing the real conclusion. Supporters of this theory point to the fact that some investigation materials were lost or classified, and not all documents are accessible to researchers even now. But it's more likely that documents were simply lost in the chaos of World War II or due to administrative oversights than because of some conspiracy. The Hinterkaifeck case has deeply penetrated the cultural consciousness of Germany and the entire world. This isn't just an unsolved murder. It's a symbol of inexplicable evil, a mystery that defies solution, a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't catch up with the criminal. In Germany, many books have been written about the Hinterkaifeck case. Some of them are strict documentary investigations based on archival materials and witness testimony. Others are fiction novels where authors offer their versions of solving the mystery. Several German filmmakers have made documentary films about the case, trying to shed new light on the old riddle. The case also inspired video game creators, artists, musicians. There are horror genre video games based on the Hinterkaifeck story. A German metal band wrote a song dedicated to this tragedy. Artists created dark illustrations and paintings depicting the farm and the events of that terrible night. Interestingly, the Hinterkaifeck case is often used in criminology schools and police academies as educational material. Students study this case, try to apply modern investigation methods to historical materials, learn to analyze evidence, and build hypotheses. In 2007, as we already mentioned, students at the police academy conducted a large-scale training investigation, and their work attracted significant media attention. In Bavarian folk culture, the Hinterkaifeck case has become part of local folklore. Old people tell this story to the young, adding elements of mysticism and the supernatural. Some claim the place where the farm stood is cursed, that you can still hear the victim's screams and the killer's footsteps there. Of course, these are just legends, but they show how deeply this case has cut into collective memory. I'm going to say a few more words about what happens to our memory of the victims. Sometimes in such high-profile cases, we get so caught up in the mystery, the search for the killer, building theories, that we forget the most important thing: the people who died. Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, little Kazilia, tiny Joseph, Maria. These were real people who had their own lives, dreams, hopes. Their lives were cut short in one terrible night, and they deserve to be remembered not only as victims of a mysterious murder, but as people. Today, having heard this story, you've become part of the chain of memory. Now you know about the Gruber family, about little Kazilia, who never went to school the next day, about tiny Joseph, who died alone in his crib. And as long as we remember them, they haven't completely disappeared from this world. Would you like me to continue the story? I can delve into details of the investigation, tell more about specific suspects, about how forensic methods changed throughout the 20th century, about other similar unsolved cases, or about anything else that interests you in this story. Today, more than 100 years after the tragedy, the Hinterkaifeck case still continues to attract the attention of researchers, criminologists, and simply people interested in unsolved mysteries. In the era of DNA analysis, computer databases, and artificial intelligence, the question arises: could this case have been solved if such technologies had existed in 1922? Experts agree that the answer is probably positive. DNA analysis of blood traces on the murder weapon, analysis of clothing fibers that the killer might have left in the attic, fingerprint examination. All this could have provided important leads. Modern methods of criminal profiling, based on behavioral analysis, could have significantly narrowed the circle of suspects. Computer databases would have allowed checking thousands of people in a matter of hours, instead of months of manual work. But we don't have a time machine. All physical evidence has been lost. All witnesses are dead. The crime scene has been erased from the face of the earth. The only thing we have is archival documents, crime scene photographs, interrogation protocols, and forensic medical reports. And even many of these materials were lost during World War II, when Allied bombing destroyed many archives in Munich. In the 2010s, a group of independent researchers, including retired criminologists, historians, and journalists, made another attempt to solve the case. They gained access to all surviving archival materials, conducted interviews with descendants of witnesses and people connected to the case, used computer modeling to reconstruct events. Their work led to several interesting discoveries. First, they found that in police archives, there were mentions of a certain person who appeared several times in the vicinity of the farm during the month before the murder. Neighbors described him as a middle-aged man in worn clothing, possibly a vagrant or day laborer. Several people saw him on the road near the farm. Once he was spotted at the forest edge, looking toward the farm. But no one paid attention to this at the time, and this person was never identified. Second, researchers found records and archives that in a neighboring district, about 40 kilometers from Hinterkaifeck, a few years before the murder, a similar though less large-scale crime occurred. An elderly couple of peasants was found murdered in their home, with the murder committed with a blunt object, possibly a hammer or axe. This case also remained unsolved. Could both crimes be the work of one person? Researchers believe this is possible, but proving the connection is now impossible. Third, they conducted a psychological analysis of all known suspects and concluded that the most likely killer was still an unknown vagrant or mentally ill person, possibly a war veteran who wandered through Bavaria and accidentally stumbled upon the Hinterkaifeck farm. This person could have suffered from a severe mental disorder that allowed him to plan the crime, but at the same time completely deprived him of empathy and normal perception of reality. Let me offer you a scenario that, based on all available data, seems most likely. This is not proven truth. We'll never know the truth. But this is a version that explains most of the oddities of this case. Somewhere in early 1922, possibly in February or even earlier, a man wandered through Bavaria. Let's call him simply the stranger. This was a man of about 40, perhaps a war veteran, perhaps just a person broken by life. He had lost everything: family, home, work, sanity. He wandered from village to village, begged for alms, sometimes found occasional work, but never stayed anywhere long. Once, passing by the Hinterkaifeck farm, he saw this place. Isolated, quiet, with a solid house and farm buildings. In his sick consciousness, an idea was born. This place could become his home. He could live here, work here, be a master, not a vagrant. But the farm was already occupied. The Gruber family lived here. This was their land, their home. The stranger began watching the farm from afar. He studied the family's routine, their habits. Then, one night, he penetrated the house's attic, perhaps through a window or through some external entrance. He made himself a nest there, in the darkness, among old things and hay, and began living there, watching the family below, listening to their conversations, their footsteps. Andreas heard these footsteps overhead, but when he checked, found no one. The stranger was hiding in some secluded corner of the attic or managed to exit through the window. The previous maid also heard sounds, also felt someone's presence, and this frightened her so much that she ran away. The stranger stole the bunch of keys to be able to freely enter and exit. He left tracks in the snow that Andreas saw. These were his tracks when he came or left the farm. He lived like this for weeks, maybe months. In his sick consciousness, a plan was forming. He had to get rid of the Gruber family. Then the farm would become his. He would be the master. He would become a person again, not a vagrant, not society's reject. The farm would heal him, restore his dignity. On March 31st, a new maid arrived. Perhaps this was a signal for the stranger. He needed to act before she discovered his presence, as the previous one had done. In the evening, when it got dark, he descended from the attic. In his hands was a pickaxe mattock that he had taken from the barn a day earlier when no one was around. Andreas and Kazilia in the barn. The stranger approaches. Perhaps Andreas recognizes the vagrant he saw several weeks ago on the road. Perhaps tries to say something. But the stranger has already raised the pickaxe mattock. In his head, everything is clear. These people stand between him and his new home. They must disappear. Blows rain down with the fury of a man who pours all his pain, all his anger at life onto defenseless people. Victoria and little Kazilia come out of the house. They too must disappear. The stranger feels no pity even for the child. In his consciousness, there's simply obstacles that need to be removed. Maria in the house hears noise, comes out to look, and becomes the next victim. Little Joseph in his crib receives blows, but the stranger, perhaps tired or simply didn't check if the child was dead. The baby is left to die slowly. And then the stranger does what seems insane to a normal person, but is completely logical to him. He begins living on the farm as he had planned. This is now his home. He is the master. The corpses around him are simply part of reality, no more frightening than furniture. His sick consciousness sees nothing strange in this. He feeds the livestock. Now, this is his livestock. He cooks food. Now, this is his kitchen. He sleeps in the house. Now, this is his home. For several days, he lives like this, enjoying his new position as farm master. But gradually, reality begins to break through the veil of madness. Food runs out. The livestock requires more care than he can provide. The corpses begin to decompose. The smell becomes unbearable. Perhaps it dawns on him that sooner or later someone will come to check why the Gruber family hasn't made contact. And so one day, on the third or fourth day, he realizes he needs to leave. His dream of his own farm has shattered. He becomes a vagrant again. He leaves the farm, leaving behind 6 corpses and a mystery that will never be solved. He dissolves into the chaos of post-war Germany, perhaps changes his name, moves to another region, maybe even leaves the country, or perhaps dies somewhere in a ditch from disease or accident, taking the secret to the grave. This is just one version, one of many, but it explains most of the case's oddities: the traces in the attic, the killer's prolonged stay on the farm after the crime, the absence of robbery attempts, the impossibility of identifying the perpetrator. What can the Hinterkaifeck case tell us, people of the 21st century? What lessons can we draw from this century-old tragedy? The first lesson is about the importance of vigilance. The Gruber family ignored warning signs. They heard strange sounds, saw tracks, discovered missing items, but didn't seek help. Perhaps out of pride, perhaps from unwillingness to draw attention to family secrets, perhaps simply from underestimating the danger. If they had called police after the first strange incidents, perhaps the tragedy could have been avoided. The second lesson is about isolation and its dangers. The Hinterkaifeck farm was cut off from the world. Neighbors were far away. Communication was primitive. When tragedy struck, no one heard cries for help. No one noticed anything unusual for 4 days. In the modern world, with mobile phones and the internet, such isolation seems unthinkable. But even today, there are people who live in remote places who don't maintain regular contact with loved ones. And for them, the danger can remain just as real as 100 years ago. The third lesson is about the nature of evil. The Hinterkaifeck case shows that evil can be completely irrational, unpredictable, without logical explanation. Crimes aren't always committed because of money, jealousy, or revenge. Sometimes a criminal acts for reasons that only make sense to themselves in their distorted perception of reality. And it's precisely such crimes that are most difficult to solve, because it's impossible to predict or understand the criminal's motivation. The fourth lesson is about the imperfection of justice. The Hinterkaifeck case reminds us that not all crimes are solved, not all criminals are punished. This is hard to accept, especially when it comes to such a monstrous crime. We want to believe that justice always prevails, that evil is always punished. But reality is more complex. Sometimes criminals go unpunished. Sometimes mysteries remain unsolved. And we must live with this knowledge. More than 100 years have passed since that terrible March night at the Hinterkaifeck farm. All participants in the events are long dead, both victims and killer, investigators and witnesses. The farm has been demolished. Other buildings stand in its place. The Bavarian fields that witnessed this tragedy continue to yield crops as if nothing had happened. Life goes on, but memory remains. 6 people were brutally murdered, and their story continues to live. It lives in archival documents, in books and articles, in documentary films and podcasts. It lives in the memory of the German people as one of the darkest pages of criminal history. And it lives in the hearts of those who hear this story and cannot remain indifferent to the suffering of innocent people. Andreas and Kazilia Gruber, elderly peasants who lived a long, difficult life and died so cruelly. Victoria, a young widow who lost her husband in the war and was trying to build a new life for herself and her children. Little Kazilia, a 7-year-old girl who never went to school the next day. Tiny Joseph, a 2-year-old baby who died alone and in pain. Maria Baumgartner, a maid who was simply looking for work and found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. These people deserve to be remembered, not only as victims of an unsolved crime, not only as a mystery for criminologists and detective enthusiasts, but as real people who had their own lives, their own joys and sorrows, their own hopes and dreams. And now, having heard their story, you too have become keepers of their memory. The Hinterkaifeck case will probably never be solved. The killer took his secret to the grave, wherever it may be. We can build theories, propose hypotheses, conduct investigations, but the final answer will forever remain beyond our understanding. And perhaps there's a bitter truth in this, a reminder that we cannot control everything, that not all questions have answers, that some mysteries remain unsolved forever. But as long as we remember the victims, as long as we tell their story, as long as we ask questions and seek answers, they're not forgotten. Their lives had meaning. Their death was not in vain, because it reminds us of the value of human life, the importance of safety and vigilance, the need to protect those who are vulnerable. The Hinterkaifeck farm no longer exists, but story lives, and will live as long as there are people who want to know the truth, who are not indifferent to the fates of others, who believe that even after a century, memory of the victims matters. This was the story of the Hinterkaifeck farm, about 6 people who were murdered on one cold March night in 1922, and about a mystery that has given no peace for more than 100 years. Thank you for listening to it until the end. Remember the victims. Remember that evil is real, but so are our ability to remember, our ability to empathize, our ability to learn from the mistakes of the past. And if someday, driving along the quiet Bavarian roads, you find yourself in the area where the Hinterkaifeck farm once stood, stop for a minute. Look at the fields, at the forest in the distance, at the peaceful rural landscape. And remember that here, in this quiet place, one of the most terrible tragedies in German history occurred. Remember 6 people whose lives were cut short, and perhaps whisper a quiet prayer or simply kind words in their memory. Because in the end, memory is all we have left. Memory of those who have gone, memory of what happened, and hope that by remembering the past, we can build a safer future. This was the Fear Files channel. Thank you for being with us. Remember, some mysteries are never solved, but stories must be told. Until we meet again.